The monitor beeped steadily, one tone after another, counting down something no one in that room dared to name. Maeve Langley lay on the hospital bed, eyes closed, face drained of color, her left shoulder wrapped tight in bandages, an IV line taped to the back of her hand, a small, thin hand, the hand of someone used to hard work and skipped meals. 27 years old. No family, no one coming to visit, but one man had been sitting beside her bed for 10 nights straight, without leaving once. Garrett Hollis, a name half of Chicago didn't dare say out loud, sat in a plastic hospital chair, both hands wrapped around hers. His ring finger tapped softly against the back of her hand. Steady. Constant. As if stopping meant the heartbeat on the screen would stop too. 10 days ago, she had stepped between him and a bullet. She wasn't his bodyguard. She wasn't one of his people. 3 months before, she had been a hotel housekeeper whose name he didn't even know. And yet when the bullet came for him, she stepped forward as if her life wasn't worth as much as his, or maybe it was worth more and she just didn't care. Now she lay here, and the most powerful man on the East Coast couldn't do a single thing except sit, hold her hand, and beg for the one thing money and power could never buy for her to open her eyes. It all started 3 months ago. A Sunday morning, an SUV jumping the curb, and a housekeeper, who didn't know anyone, throwing herself in to save the mother of the most dangerous man in the city. From that moment on, no one in this story was ever the same. If this story touched you, hit like to support us. Share this video with someone you think needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next. We promise, every story is worth staying for. 3 months earlier, the Hollis mansion sat on the western outskirts of Chicago, hidden behind a 10-foot iron fence and 2 layers of controlled gates. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary estate belonging to the upper class. Inside, it was the operating center of an empire no map acknowledged. That night, 11 people sat around the long oak table in the first-floor conference room. No one held private conversations. No one looked at a phone. At the head of the table, Garrett Hollis leaned back in his chair, both hands resting on the tabletop, his eyes fixed on the man seated midway down the right side. His name was Donnie, 36 years old. He'd been in charge of the southern transport route for 4 years, and the week before, he'd lost a shipment worth nearly $2 million. Garrett didn't shout. He didn't slam the table. He didn't stand up. He only looked at Donnie, silent. The kind of silence everyone who'd ever sat in that room understood was heavier than any curse. Donnie began to explain. Garrett lifted one finger, lightly, and Donnie stopped halfway through. "Did that shipment arrive?" Garrett asked. His voice was ordinary, as if he were asking about the weather. Donnie swallowed. "No, sir." Garrett nodded, slowly. Then he looked toward Warren Briggs, the man seated to his right, closest to him, as always. Warren understood. He stood, placed a hand on Donnie's shoulder, and led him out of the room. No one at the table dared turn their head to watch. The door closed. Garrett turned to the next page of the document and said, "The northern route. Who's reporting?" The meeting continued as if nothing had happened, because to Garrett Hollis, it truly was nothing. Just a problem that had been handled. One of hundreds of problems he handled every month, without needing to raise his voice by even a single note. Garrett Hollis was 33 years old. He'd inherited the Hollis family from his father, Richard Hollis, the man who'd built this network from a small neighborhood on the south side of Chicago into a system that controlled almost every underground operation across the eastern coast of the United States. Richard had died 7 years earlier. Garrett took over when he was 26. No one thought he would hold it. They were all wrong. He didn't just hold it. He expanded it, and he did it with something his father hadn't possessed. A patience so cold it made people forget how young he still was. Warren Briggs was Garrett's second in command. 12 years. From the time Richard was still alive, Warren had been there. When Garrett stepped into his father's place, Warren was the only man who crossed over to his side without asking questions. Without promises. Without conditions. He simply stood beside Garrett and said, "I'm here." From that moment on, the two men ran the family like two hands of the same body. Garrett thought, Warren acted. Garrett stayed silent. Warren understood. In a world where loyalty was measured in blood, Warren Briggs was the only person Garrett trusted absolutely, beside one other, his mother. Catherine Hollis was 64 years old. She didn't attend any meetings, didn't know the details of any shipment route, and didn't want to know. But every person in that mansion, from Garrett to the gate guard, understood one thing. Catherine Hollis was the only person Garrett never said no to. Every Sunday morning, she went to Mass at St. Clement Church, in the old neighborhood where she'd grown up, before Richard, before the Empire, before all of it. She refused the armored car. She refused the entourage. She allowed only one bodyguard to follow her, keeping his distance, far enough away that she wouldn't have to see him. Garrett had argued with her about it more times than he'd argued with anyone else in his life, and every time, she ended it with the same sentence. "I don't live in a cage, Garrett." Then she picked up her purse and walked to the door, and he stood there, watching her leave, his jaw clenched tight, unable to say another word. That Sunday morning, Catherine Hollis stepped out of St. Clement Church at 9:15. The March sunlight was pale and cold. The street was empty. Her bodyguard stood 20 meters away, leaning against a lamppost, his eyes sweeping the curb. And at the end of the street, a black SUV was idling. At the same time, less than 100 meters from St. Clement Church, Maeve Langley was walking along the opposite sidewalk, 27 years old. Her night shift at the Morrison Hotel had ended at 6 o'clock in the morning. 3 hours of walking, 2 bus rides, and now she was on the final stretch back to her studio apartment on the south side. A single small room smaller than most of the rooms she cleaned every night. Maeve had lost her mother when she was 12. Her father had never appeared. She grew up in the foster care system, passed through 4 families before she turned 18, and stepped out into the world alone. No one held her back. She didn't expect anyone to. Hotel housekeeping was the work she chose, not because she loved it, but because it was the thing she knew how to do best. Stepping into other people's rooms, wiping away their traces, putting their lives back in order, then disappearing before they returned. No one remembered her face. No one needed to remember. She was invisible, and most of the time, she was fine with that. That Sunday morning, she was tired, her back aching dully from 8 hours of bending over to change sheets, and the only thing on her mind was the box of cereal left in her kitchen cabinet. The street was empty. The sunlight was faint. She walked past St. Clement Church without looking in, only catching a glimpse of an old woman with silver hair stepping down the front steps, a small prayer book in her hand. Then she heard the engine, not the sound of an ordinary car. It was the sudden roar of acceleration, the kind of sound no vehicle on a quiet residential street at 9 o'clock in the morning should make. Maeve turned her head. The black SUV at the end of the street was coming fast, not on the road, but up on the sidewalk, and it was aiming straight at the woman who had just stepped down from the church's final step. Everything happened in a few seconds. Maeve looked toward the old woman's bodyguard. He was already collapsed behind a tree 15 meters away, unconscious. Someone had knocked him out beforehand without anyone knowing. There was no one else on the street. No one between the SUV and that woman except Maeve. She screamed, "Move! Move now!" Catherine Hollis turned back, her eyes wide, but her feet couldn't move in time. 64 years old, her reflexes no longer as quick as her body needed them to be. Maeve ran. She didn't think, didn't calculate. Her legs moved before her mind could understand what she was doing. She rushed across the street toward Catherine, and instead of holding her, instead of using her own body as a shield, she did the only thing that could save them both. She pushed. Her 2 hands grabbed Catherine by the shoulders and shoved her hard toward the gap between 2 parked cars along the curb. Catherine stumbled into that space, her back striking a car door, her head hitting the side of the parked car. Then she fell to the pavement. Maeve didn't get out of the way in time. The SUV grazed her, the side mirror striking her right hip, the force whipping her down and dragging her across the pavement for 2 or 3 meters before the vehicle lost control and slammed straight into the lamppost at the end of the street. The sound of metal folding in on itself, glass breaking, then the sound of a car door opening, footsteps running, and the driver vanished into the alley behind them before anyone could clearly see his face. Maeve lay on the pavement. Her back burned raw. Her right hip hurt so badly she wasn't sure she could stand. But she turned her head and looked toward the 2 parked cars. Catherine was lying motionless in that space, not moving. Maeve crawled back. Her knees scraped over the asphalt, her hands trembling, but she reached Catherine. The woman lay on her side, eyes closed, a wound on her head seeping blood. Maeve placed 2 fingers against her neck, searching for a pulse. There. Weak, but there. She was still breathing. Maeve held Catherine's head still, not moving her, exactly the way she'd learned in the free first aid course at the community center the year before. A pedestrian ran over, his face white with fear. Maeve spoke to him, her voice calmer than she imagined it could be. "Call 911. Tell them she has a head injury. Don't move her," the man called. Maeve held Catherine still. She didn't know who the woman was, didn't know her name, didn't know whose mother she was. She only knew that she was lying on the sidewalk, unmoving, and there was no one else here but her. The ambulance arrived in 9 minutes. They lifted Catherine onto the stretcher first, then came back to help Maeve. She had severe scrapes across her entire back, deep bruising along her right ribs, and swelling in her right shoulder. But she was conscious. She could walk. She refused the stretcher and climbed into the ambulance herself, sitting beside the woman she had just saved, one hand gripping the side rail, the other still resting on Catherine's arm as if she were afraid that if she let go, the woman would slip away. At the hospital, the doctor confirmed that Catherine Hollis had suffered a traumatic brain injury from the impact, was in a coma, and the time of recovery remained unknown. Maeve was bandaged, given x-rays, and kept in an observation room. She lay there alone, staring at the ceiling, listening to the machinery from the room next door drifting through the wall. At the mansion on the western outskirts of Chicago, Garrett Hollis's phone vibrated in the middle of a meeting. He picked it up, listened. His face didn't change for the first 3 seconds. Then it changed. He stood, didn't say a word. The entire conference room went silent. 10 men watching as he walked toward the door, and none of them dared ask what had just happened. Because they had seen his face, and that face was something no one in that room ever wanted to see a second time. Garrett reached the hospital in 14 minutes. Under normal circumstances, that distance took 30 minutes. No one asked how fast the driver had gone. 2 black SUVs stopped in front of the emergency entrance. 6 men stepped out first, securing the path. And then Garrett stepped out after them. He didn't run. He walked fast, with long strides, his face as flat as water no one had touched. But anyone who looked closely would have seen his jaw clenched so tightly the veins stood out at both temples. The 4th-floor VIP corridor was cleared in less than 2 minutes after his team entered. Hospital security didn't object. They knew they shouldn't object. The doctor on duty was a man in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair, holding a chart in his hand, and when he began explaining the situation, his voice trembled slightly at the ends of his sentences. Traumatic brain injury from impact, moderate brain hemorrhage, coma, recovery time unknown, close monitoring required during the first 48 hours. Garrett didn't look at the doctor the entire time he spoke. He looked at the door at the end of the hallway. When the doctor stopped talking, Garrett walked straight into that room without saying a word. Catherine Hollis lay on the hospital bed, tubes and wires all over her body. The heart monitor beeped steadily on her right. An IV line was inserted into the back of her hand, secured with medical tape. Her face looked pale beneath the white lights, and she was smaller than he remembered. That was the first thing he noticed. His mother was much smaller than he remembered. The woman who had raised him, who had stood with her back straight in front of the most dangerous men in Chicago without trembling, who had looked into her husband's eyes every night, and chosen to stay even though she knew everything. That woman now lay on a hospital bed and looked so small that Garrett had to swallow something in his throat before he could keep looking. His face didn't change, but his right hand tightened into a fist, his knuckles turning white, and the ring finger of his left hand began tapping against the metal bed rail. Steady, soft, constant. No one knew how long he stood there, because no one dared open the door. Then he stepped back into the hallway. Warren was already waiting, his back against the wall, his face grave. Garrett said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "Find out who did this. Who was behind it? I want to know before my mother wakes up." Warren looked at him. After over a decade of shared history, Warren knew how to decipher every hidden shift in his boss's voice. His normal voice was an order. His cold voice was a warning. But the soft voice he had just used, the voice someone who didn't know him might mistake for calm, that was the most dangerous voice of all. It was the voice of a man who had already made his decision and was only waiting for a name before he began. Warren nodded and turned away. Garrett went back into the room, closed the door, sat down in the chair beside his mother's bed. He took her hand, small, dry, warmer than he expected for someone in a coma, and held it between both of his. The room was silent. There was only the sound of the monitor. And in that room, with no one there except him and her. Garrett Hollis, the man half the city feared, sat holding his mother's hand and cried. Not loudly, not with shaking shoulders. The tears ran down while his face barely changed, as if his body were doing something it had forgotten how to do long ago, and no longer knew how to move the muscles of his face the right way. He just sat there, holding her hand, and let the tears fall on their own. 15 minutes later, he wiped his face with the back of his hand, stood, and asked the nurse outside the door, "The woman who saved my mother, where is she?" "Room 311, end of the hallway." The nurse led him there. Before opening the door, he stopped for one beat, breathed in, and when he stepped across the threshold, everything that had just happened in his mother's room, the tears, the softness, the son afraid of losing his mother, all of it had disappeared. The man who entered Maeve Langley's room was Garrett Hollis, head of the family, and he hadn't come to say thank you. He had come to ask questions. Maeve was lying on the bed, her back wrapped in bandages, her face exhausted. She watched him step inside, a tall man in a dark suit, with cold gray eyes, accompanied by two men who stood outside the door without entering. She didn't know who he was, but she recognized this kind of man, the kind of man the world around him automatically cleared a path for. Garrett didn't sit. He stood at the foot of the bed, both hands in his trouser pockets, looking at her with the assessing stare he used on everyone the first time he met them. He didn't ask whether she was in pain, didn't ask whether she was all right. "What were you doing there this morning?" His voice was flat. "Who sent you?" Maeve looked at him. She didn't push herself up, didn't act afraid, didn't lower her eyes. She looked straight into his eyes in a way very few people in Garrett's life had ever done without paying a price. "No one sent me," she said. Her voice was calm, a little hoarse from exhaustion, but steady. "I was coming home from work. I saw the car coming. I pulled her out of the way. That's all." Silence. Garrett looked at her. He read faces better than most people alive. It was a survival skill in his world. He searched for signs of lying, hesitation, a glance to the side, a swallow, anything that showed this story had been prepared in advance. He found nothing. She looked at him the way she would look at a stranger asking for directions, not afraid, not trying to impress him, not pleading, just answering, then waiting. He nodded, briefly, then turned and walked out. Outside the door, he said to his men without looking back, "Check everything about her. All of it. I want it before tonight." The report was on the table in his mother's room at 7 o'clock that evening. Maeve Langley, 27 years old, born in Savannah, Georgia. No criminal record, no connection to any organization, no significant relationships. Her financial history showed a low but steady income from housekeeping work, with no unusual transactions. Clean. Completely clean. Garrett read the report once, folded it, slipped it into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. Then he sat down beside his mother's bed, took her hand, and said nothing more for a very long time. Maeve was discharged from the hospital 2 days later. The doctor told her she should stay one more night so they could monitor the bruising around her ribs, but she signed herself out voluntarily. She didn't have enough insurance coverage to stay any longer, and she wasn't used to lying still in one place, waiting for someone else to take care of her. She called a taxi with the last money in her wallet, went back to her studio apartment on the south side, locked the door, and lay down on the bed without changing her clothes. Her whole body hurt, her back burned every time it touched the sheets. But she was home, she was safe. At least, she thought she was. 11 o'clock at night, a knock at the door. Not an ordinary knock. 2 knocks, slow, evenly spaced, as if whoever was knocking wanted her to know they were there but didn't need her to open the door. Maeve lay still on the bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. She waited. There wasn't a third knock. There were no footsteps walking away. Only silence. She waited 5 minutes. Then she got up, quietly, without turning on the light. She went to the door and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. No one was there. She opened the door just wide enough for a crack. On the floor, right in front of the threshold, was a white envelope. No name, no address. Just a clean white envelope placed neatly on the tile floor. Maeve picked it up, closed the door, locked it again. She opened the envelope with her hands, without needing a knife. Inside were a photograph and a small piece of paper. The photograph had been taken from a distance, but it was clear. It was a picture of her, the exact moment she was pulling Catherine across the sidewalk in front of St. Clement Church. Her face was clear, and the angle showed that whoever took it had been standing on the other side of the street, close enough to see the details, far enough away that no one would notice. The piece of paper had one handwritten line, the handwriting even, not rushed. "You shouldn't have been there, T. Kleine." Maeve looked at the photograph, looked at the line of writing. Her hand didn't shake, her face didn't change. But inside, something tightened, an old instinct she had carried since childhood. The thing that had taught her that when danger came, you didn't call for help, didn't wait for anyone to come, didn't trust that someone else would solve it for you. You moved, immediately. She didn't call the police. She didn't call anyone at all. She took the small duffel bag from under the bed and put in a few sets of clothes, her papers, a toothbrush, and an envelope of cash she kept hidden inside a cereal box on top of the refrigerator. She turned off the lights, looked through the window down into the alley below, and waited until she was sure no one was standing there. Then she left the apartment at 3 o'clock in the morning. She walked 15 minutes to the night bus stop, sat in the back row, and she went to the only place her mind could think of, the hospital. At 4 o'clock in the morning, Maeve sat in a chair in the 4th floor waiting room, 3 doors away from Catherine Hollis's room. She drew her legs up onto the chair, held the bag in her lap, and leaned her back against the wall. She didn't sleep. She just sat there, eyes open, looking at the empty hallway in front of her, waiting for morning. She didn't know why she had come here. Maybe because this was the only place in the city where she had any connection to another person, even if that person was unconscious and didn't know she existed. Maybe because she had nowhere else to go. Those two things, for Maeve, were often the same. The next morning, Garrett came to visit his mother at 7 o'clock. He stepped out of the 4th floor elevator, walked past the waiting room, and saw her, sitting on the plastic chair, her bag at her feet, dark circles under her eyes, still wearing the clothes she had been discharged in. She didn't look at him when he stopped. She looked straight ahead, as if she were trying not to exist. Garrett stood there for 3 seconds. He didn't need to ask. He looked at the bag, looked at her eyes, looked at the way she sat folded into herself, like someone used to finding the smallest corner in a room and disappearing into it, and he understood. Someone had come for her. He sat down in the chair beside her, not too close, not too far, close enough to talk without making her feel cornered. "It isn't safe for you out there anymore," he said. His voice wasn't soft, wasn't hard, just flat, as if he were stating a fact. "That's the truth, not an invitation." Maeve was silent for a while. Then she said, without looking at him, "I don't need anyone to protect me." "I didn't say protection," Garrett replied. "When my mother wakes up, she'll need someone to care for her. She's stubborn. She won't listen to doctors, won't listen to me. You kept her alive on the sidewalk, so maybe you're the only person she'll listen to. Consider it a job, paid, with a place to stay, no strings." Maeve looked at him for the first time since he had sat down. She searched his face for something. Maybe pity, maybe intent, maybe the kind of look she had seen too many times in her life. The look of a person giving something away and expecting something in return. She didn't find it. His face was as still as it had been when he walked into her hospital room the day before. She looked down at the bag by her feet. Everything she had in the world was inside that bag, and that bag could be carried in one hand. She nodded, said nothing more. 1 hour later, a car took Maeve to the Hollis mansion. She sat in the back seat, silent, looking through the window. Chicago passed outside, from neighborhoods she knew into neighborhoods where she had never set foot. The car passed through 2 layers of controlled gates and onto the stone drive leading to the main house. She stepped out of the car, stood on the walkway, and looked up. The mansion was larger than any place she had ever lived in, ever cleaned, ever seen in real life. She tightened her hand around the strap of her bag, her fingers turning white. This was not her world, but her world, the studio apartment, the alley, the single bed against the wall, had just closed its door behind her. During the first days inside the Hollis mansion, Maeve did the only thing she knew how to do. She cleaned. She kept Catherine's room spotless every day, changed the sheets regularly, opened the curtains at the right hour to let the light in, and replaced the fresh flowers on the bedside table before they had time to wilt. She mopped the floor, folded towels, and arranged the medication exactly according to the schedule the doctor had given. No one assigned those tasks to her. She did them herself, because that was how she survived anywhere, by finding what needed to be done, doing it better than anyone expected, and becoming necessary before someone had time to think about sending her away. It wasn't a strategy. It was instinct. Catherine woke on the 10th day. She opened her eyes close to noon, looked around the room with a hazy gaze, and the first thing she asked was what time it was. The doctor examined her and confirmed that she was stable, but her body was weak. She had to sit in a wheelchair, her legs still not strong enough to stand, her right hand trembling slightly when she held objects. Garrett stayed beside his mother's bed all that day, holding her hand and saying very little. When she fell asleep again, he stepped outside and called Warren. But before he left, he looked at Maeve standing in the corner of the room and nodded to her. He didn't say anything, just nodded. His meaning was clear. She's yours now. Catherine Hollis wasn't an easy patient. She hated lying still, hated taking medicine, hated being treated like a sick person, and most of all, she hated eating. On the first morning after she woke, Maeve carried in a tray of food and set it in front of her. Catherine looked at the tray, looked at the bowl of porridge, looked at the plate of sliced fruit, then pushed the tray away. I don't want to eat. Maeve looked at her. She didn't plead, didn't coax. She pulled a chair over and sat down beside the bed, looked straight into Catherine's eyes, and spoke in the voice she used for every truth in her life, flat, with no extra emotion, but without missing a single word. If you don't eat, you won't have strength. If you don't have strength, you won't walk. How long do you want to stay in this bed? Catherine looked at her. 3 seconds of silence. Her eyes widened slightly. The eyes of someone used to everyone around her being gentle, cautious, choosing every word carefully, and then suddenly meeting someone who spoke straight to her face without blinking. Then she laughed. A small laugh, a little hoarse because her throat was still dry, but real. This girl is as stubborn as my son, she said. Then she pulled the tray back and ate. Not because she was hungry, because she had just met someone she couldn't bully. From that day on, Maeve cared for Catherine every day, not like a maid caring for a patient, like one stubborn person caring for another stubborn person. Catherine demanded to push her own wheelchair, and Maeve let her try, standing beside her without saying a word, waiting until she grew tired before pushing her without asking whether she needed help. Catherine refused to take her evening medicine, and Maeve placed the pills on the table, set the glass of water beside them, then walked away. 10 minutes later, when she came back, the glass was lower. The two of them didn't argue. They measured each other through small, silent battles, and somehow, both of them won. One afternoon, Catherine looked at her while Maeve was changing the sheets, and asked softly, "Are they giving you a hard time?" She didn't say who they were, but Maeve understood that she meant the men in the mansion, Garrett's men, the ones who watched her with searching eyes every time she walked past. Maeve didn't stop working. "I can handle it, ma'am." Catherine looked at her for another beat, then nodded and didn't ask anything else. Every afternoon, when the weather was warm enough, Maeve pushed Catherine's wheelchair into the garden behind the mansion. The garden was wide, with rows of maple trees along the path and a stone bench. Catherine said her husband, Richard, had placed there during the first year they moved in. She told Maeve about those years, when Richard had nothing yet, when the whole family was only the two of them in a one-room apartment on the south side. She didn't tell those stories to show off. She told them because she liked remembering, and Maeve was someone who knew how to listen without interrupting. One afternoon, she talked about Garrett. He was a quiet child, she said, her eyes on the maple trees. Always so serious, like an old man. His friends played outside in the yard, and he stood at the window watching, not because he was sad. He just liked observing more than joining in. I knew even then that this child would be like his father. Maeve listened and didn't comment. But that night, when she saw Garrett sitting alone in the study at the end of the hallway, the desk lamp casting light across his face, she looked at him and, for the first time, saw something other than the Mafia boss. She saw the child standing at the window. Then one afternoon, the air was colder than usual. Maeve laid an extra blanket over Catherine's legs, and Catherine caught her hand. She didn't let go. She looked at Maeve, her eyes gentle, the kind of gentleness that belonged to someone who had lived long enough to recognize something in another person. That person had hidden very carefully. "Where's your mother, Maeve?" she asked softly. Maeve fell silent. 1 beat, 2 beats. Then she said, her voice ordinary, as if she were talking about the weather, She's gone, since I was 12. Catherine said nothing else. She didn't ask more. Didn't say poor child or I understand or any of the sentences Maeve had heard too many times in her life and no longer wanted to hear. She only tightened her hand around Maeve's, held on, silent, and from that day forward, whenever she called Maeve, she didn't call her by name. She called child. Garrett didn't know about that, but he knew something else. One afternoon, he came to visit his mother earlier than usual, passed through the back hallway, looked out at the garden through the glass door, and stopped. His mother was sitting in her wheelchair beneath the maple trees. Maeve was sitting on the stone bench beside her, and Catherine was holding her hand. She was laughing, not the polite smile she gave doctors or subordinates. A real smile, the kind Garrett couldn't remember seeing the last time. Maybe before his father died. Maybe longer. He stood behind the glass, looking at those two women for a long while. Then he turned away and stepped lightly, not letting anyone see that he had been standing there. But while his mother was laughing in the garden, Garrett was still looking for the answer to a question that had no solution yet. Who had ordered the black SUV to drive up onto the sidewalk that Sunday morning? Who had known Catherine's exact mass schedule? And why was the report Warren brought back so flawlessly detailed that it left no room for doubt? 48 hours after the attack, Garrett's team found the driver of the SUV. His name was Curtis Boyle, 31 years old, with a criminal record 2 pages long, hiding in a cheap motel on the southern outskirts, 40 minutes by car from Chicago. He hadn't been able to get far because he had broken his wrist when the SUV hit the lamppost, and he wasn't smart enough to understand that with the Hollis family, 40 minutes or 4,000 miles made no difference at all. They took him to a warehouse in the Western Industrial District. Garrett arrived at 9 o'clock at night. He walked in alone, bringing no one with him except Warren, who stood outside the door. Inside, Curtis Boyle sat in a chair, his hands tied behind his back, his face swollen, his eyes afraid. Garrett didn't look at the injuries on his face. He pulled over a folding chair, placed it across from him, and sat down. The distance between the two men was less than 1 meter. Garrett didn't hit him, didn't threaten him, didn't raise his voice. He only sat there, both hands resting on his thighs, his eyes fixed on Curtis Boyle, and stayed silent. 10 seconds, 20 seconds. Curtis began jerking his leg. 30 seconds. Curtis swallowed, his eyes darting sideways, searching for a door, searching for anything other than the flat gray eyes sitting across from him. "Who paid you?" Garrett asked. His voice was ordinary, not cold, not hot, ordinary, and that was the most frightening thing, because it meant that to Garrett, this conversation wasn't any more important than any other conversation he'd had that day. Curtis Boyle didn't matter. Only the answer mattered. Curtis talked, quickly, stammering, his eyes running back and forth. He had taken the order through a middleman, someone he had never met face to face, someone who only contacted him through a disposable phone. The money had been transferred into an anonymous account, in 2 payments, one before and one after. He didn't know who was behind it. He didn't know who the woman in front of the church was. He had only been told to go to the right place, at the right time, and drive up onto the sidewalk. He said he had thought it was only meant to scare someone, that he hadn't thought anyone would be standing on the sidewalk then. Garrett listened until he was finished. He didn't ask anything else. He knew Curtis Boyle had said everything he knew, because whoever hired him had been smart enough not to let him know anything more than necessary. That was how professionals worked. Curtis Boyle wasn't a professional. Curtis Boyle was a tool meant to be used once. Garrett stood, pushed the chair aside, and walked toward the door. As he passed one of his men standing in the corner of the warehouse, he said a single word: "Handle it." Then he walked outside without looking back. That same night, Garrett called Warren into the study at the mansion. He gave Warren the information about the anonymous account Curtis Boyle had provided and said, "Trace the money back. I want to know who this account belongs to." Warren took the order, nodded, and stepped out. This was the normal process. This was how they had operated for as long as anyone could remember. A well-oiled machine built on lifetime promises. But Garrett did one more thing Warren didn't know about. 30 minutes after Warren left the room, Garrett took another phone from the locked drawer of his desk. This phone didn't exist in any record. He called a man named Stafford, a former federal financial analyst, who now ran a private investigation team whose existence only Garrett knew about. This had been Garrett's habit from the day he took over the family. Never place all trust in a single source. He trusted Warren, but he trusted his own principles more than he trusted anyone. He gave Stafford the same account information and said, "Trace it separately. Don't report to anyone. Report only to me." 5 days later, 2 reports lay on Garrett's desk on the same evening. Warren's report arrived first. It was impeccable, concise, and structured with professional precision. The account led to a shell company registered in Delaware, with no real business activity, no clear shareholders, and no further trace possible. Warren concluded that the money trail had been cut off at the intermediate layer, and that more time or an inside source would be needed to go any further. Stafford's report arrived at 9 o'clock at night. That shell company account was indirectly connected, through 2 more layers, to a financial network Stafford had spent 3 weeks untangling, and at the end of that network was one name: Dunmore. The Dunmore family, the Hollis family's greatest rival on the East Coast, led by Philip Dunmore. Garrett read both reports, placed them side by side on the desk. On one side was Warren's report, polished to absolute perfection, so neat it didn't contain one unnecessary question. On the other side was Stafford's report, messier, filled with more theories. But it went farther, deeper, and led to a specific name. Garrett sat still, staring at those 2 reports for a very long time. A real investigation was never as clean as Warren's report. A real investigation was always messy, full of dead ends, full of unanswered questions. Warren's report was too clean, too neat, as if someone had cleared the road in advance. He didn't know yet who the traitor was, but he knew, as surely as he knew his own name, that there was a traitor very close by. While Garrett was sitting in his study, staring at the 2 reports, Maeve was upstairs, changing the sheets in the guest room at the end of the hallway. She knew nothing about Dunmore, nothing about anonymous accounts or shell companies. She only knew how to do her work, clean, care for Catherine, and survive inside a house where she didn't belong. But there was one thing Maeve knew how to do better than most people in the world, and that was observe. 15 years of hotel housekeeping had taught her that everyone left traces behind. A coffee cup placed on the left or on the right told her which hand a person used. A pillow shoved out of place on one side told her which way they turned in their sleep. A strand of hair on the second pillow told her they hadn't slept alone the night before. She didn't mean to look. She just looked. And she remembered. It wasn't a skill she had learned. It was something formed when a child grew up in too many places and had to read every new house to know whether she was safe or not. As the days blurred into weeks inside the mansion, she began to notice that Warren Briggs had a strange habit. Every Thursday afternoon, around 2 o'clock, Warren left the mansion. He told the security team he was going to check the northern route. His car drove out through the main gate, turned left, and headed north. Maeve knew this because Thursday afternoon was usually when she pushed Catherine out into the garden, and from the garden, she could see the road in front of the mansion through the iron fence. She wasn't trying to look, but she saw. The first time, Warren's car came back 2 hours later from the south. She thought nothing of it. Maybe he had taken a roundabout way home. The second time, the following week, it was Thursday afternoon again, 2 hours again, and the car came back from the south again. She began to pay attention. The third time, she confirmed it. Warren left heading north but always returned from the south. He wasn't checking the northern route. He was going somewhere else. Around that same time, Maeve noticed one more thing. From the window of her room on the second floor, she could see the end of the road leading into the mansion, before the first security gate. And there was a car she had seen parked there several times, not one of the Hollis cars. A dark gray sedan, parked along the shoulder, engine left running, staying there for about 15 or 20 minutes before leaving. The first time she saw it was Tuesday morning. The second time was Friday afternoon. She remembered the license plate because she was used to remembering hotel room numbers, and a license plate was only another string of numbers. Both times, the same plate. She didn't tell anyone. Not yet. She wasn't certain enough. As time pressed on, Maeve found herself cleaning Warren's study while he was away. He was away. The room was empty, and she went in to wipe the desk the way she always did. She didn't rummage. She didn't open drawers. She only wiped the desk, vacuumed the floor, and picked up a few dirty coffee cups. But when she passed the chair near the door, where Warren usually draped his jacket, she saw a small piece of paper sticking out from the breast pocket. She didn't pull it out. She only looked. The paper was folded in half, one corner exposed, and on that corner was a handwritten string of letters and numbers. A license plate. She could read the last 4 characters. They were the same as the plate on the gray sedan she had seen parked at the end of the road twice. She left the room, closed the door, and continued cleaning the next room, as if nothing had happened. But in her mind, 3 pieces had already fitted together. Warren disappeared every Thursday afternoon and returned from the wrong direction. A strange car parked near the mansion several times a week, and that car's license plate was in Warren's jacket pocket. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew it wasn't normal, and she knew that if she spoke too soon, if she falsely accused Garrett's closest man, the consequence wouldn't be losing her job. In this world, consequences were much heavier than that. She waited 1 more week, watched 1 more Thursday afternoon. Warren left. The car came back from the south. The gray sedan appeared on Wednesday morning. Everything was consistent. No coincidence repeated itself 4 times in a row, and remained a coincidence. She went to see Garrett one evening, after Catherine had fallen asleep. He was sitting in his study. She knocked on the door. He looked up, slightly surprised, because she had never come to this room before. She stepped inside, stood in front of his desk, and spoke. No circling around. No introduction. She told him about the Thursday afternoons, about the direction the car returned from, about the gray sedan, about the license plate in the jacket pocket. She gave every detail in chronological order, clearly, without adding anything, without leaving anything out, without guessing. Then she said, "The person who arranged protection for your mother is also the person who knew exactly when she wouldn't be protected. I didn't want to falsely accuse one of your men, so I waited until I was certain." Garrett looked at her, said nothing. The room fell silent. He looked at her for a long time, not with the interrogating stare he had used the first time in the hospital, but with the gaze of a man reassessing everything he thought he knew about the person standing in front of him. For the first time in his life, the most valuable intelligence hadn't come from Stafford, hadn't come from the investigation team, hadn't come from anyone inside his organization. It came from a housekeeper, someone who had seen what no one else had seen, because no one was looking at her. He nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said. Just those 2 words. Maeve nodded, turned away, and closed the door behind her. She went back to her room, lay down, and her heart beat faster than it had at any moment since the night she received the white envelope. Garrett remained sitting alone. Maeve's 3 pieces fit perfectly with what he had already suspected. The report that was too clean. Thursday afternoon. The gray sedan. Dunmore. All of it led in the same direction. And that direction passed straight through the man he trusted most. He didn't call Warren in to confront him. Not yet. He wouldn't strike at the snake out in the open. He would set a trap. That night, after leaving Garrett's study, Maeve couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling, listening to her heartbeat slow down, but not slow enough to let sleep come. She had just accused a Mafia boss's second-in-command. She didn't know whether she had just done the right thing or signed her own death sentence. She only knew she had told the truth, and truth in this house carried a different weight than truth in any place she had ever lived. Around 11 o'clock at night, she walked through the first-floor hallway to get some water. Garrett's study was at the end of the hall, the door slightly open, the desk lamp spilling a thin strip of light across the wooden floor. She didn't mean to stop, but she heard his voice. Garrett was on the phone. His voice was soft, even, calm. Exactly like his voice when he sat at breakfast or asked his mother how she was feeling that day. But the content wasn't. She couldn't hear all of it, only a few words slipping through the crack in the door, just enough to understand that the person on the other end of the line was receiving news they didn't want to receive, and Garrett was delivering it without changing the rhythm of his breathing. No threats, no anger. He spoke as if he were reading a grocery list. And it was that calmness that made Maeve stop walking, because she understood, in the instinctive way that needed no explanation, that a person who could speak about things like that, without changing his voice, was far more dangerous than someone who shouted or slammed a table. The one who shouted was someone losing control. The one who stayed calm was someone who had already decided before he opened his mouth. She walked away quietly, got her water, and returned to her room, lay down. Still couldn't sleep. At 2 o'clock in the morning, she gave up. She got out of bed and went barefoot down to the kitchen, hoping a glass of warm milk would make her eyes feel heavier. The kitchen was dark. She turned on the small light above the counter. and only then did she see that Garrett was already sitting at the kitchen table, in the dark, a half-drunk glass of water in front of him. He didn't look up when the light came on. He only said softly, "Just the small light." She turned off the counter light and turned on the under-cabinet light instead, the dim yellow glow just bright enough to see by. She poured the milk and sat down on the other side of the table. Didn't ask. Didn't speak. She wasn't the kind of person who filled silence with meaningless sentences, and it seemed Garrett wasn't either. They sat like that for a long while, maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10. The kitchen was quiet. The refrigerator hummed steadily. Wind moved outside the window. Nothing else. Two people who didn't really know each other sitting in the same kitchen at 2 o'clock in the morning, both unable to sleep, and both not needing to explain why. Garrett spoke first. "What are you most afraid of?" The question came without warning, without a lead-in, as if he had been thinking it in his head for a while, and had decided to say it instead of keeping it there. Maeve looked at him. In the dim yellow light, his face looked more tired than it did during the day. The sharp lines were still there, but they were less hard, less controlled, as if at night he allowed himself to look a little more human. She thought, not because she didn't know the answer. She knew. She had just never said it out loud to anyone. "Dying without anyone knowing," she said. Her voice was quiet, ordinary, as if she were talking about something that had happened to someone else. "Not fear of dying, fear of disappearing and no one realizing I was ever here. Fear that one day I'll be gone, and the world won't be missing anything at all. No one mentions me, no one remembers, like I never existed. Silence, long, the refrigerator, the wind." Garrett looked at her. Not with an assessing stare, not with pity, with the look of someone who had just heard something he recognized, perhaps because he understood it in his own way, though his life was entirely different from hers. "I know you're here," he said, not loudly, not with emphasis. He didn't look into her eyes when he said it, but at the glass of water in front of him, as if he were stating an obvious truth he didn't understand why he had to say out loud, but said because she needed to hear it. Maeve didn't answer. She picked up the glass of milk, took a sip, and set it down, and in that dim kitchen, for the first time in many years, someone told her she existed. Not with a promise, not with an embrace, with one flat sentence, without any extra emotion, from a man she had heard speak about terrible things in that same calm voice. And somehow, that made the sentence feel truer than any comfort she had ever received in her life. She stood, washed the glass, and placed it upside down on the rack. "Good night," she said, without turning back. Then she went upstairs. Garrett remained sitting in the kitchen, alone. His glass of water still unfinished. He couldn't sleep. He had never been able to sleep at night, not because of nightmares or any specific worry, but because his mind had no off switch. During the day, he controlled everything. Controlled people, controlled money, controlled territory, even controlled the way he breathed. And at night, when there was nothing left to control, that mind kept running, kept calculating, kept preparing, kept checking every decision of the day. Insomnia wasn't his illness, it was the price. On the second floor, Maeve lay down in bed and pulled the blanket up. The room was dark, quiet. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in many nights, she felt as if she might be able to sleep. Then the phone on her nightstand vibrated. Once. A message. She picked it up. The screen lit. An automated message from the hospital. Appointment reminder. Lung tumor biopsy results. Appointment date. Next Wednesday. She looked at the screen. Blue light reflected on her face in the dark. She looked at that line for 3 seconds. 4 seconds. Then she turned off the screen, placed the phone face down, turned toward the wall, and closed her eyes. The next morning, Garrett had been sitting in his study since 6 o'clock. In front of him, on the oak desk, were 3 things. Warren's report, which now felt heavily orchestrated in its perfection. Stafford's report, leading straight to Dunmore. And in his mind, Maeve's 3 pieces. Thursday afternoon, the direction of the car, the license plate. 3 separate sources, none of them knowing about the others, and all 3 pointed in the same direction. Warren Briggs was selling information to Dunmore. Garrett didn't call Warren in, didn't confront him, didn't ask why. In his world, why didn't matter. Why was a luxury for people who had time to sit around analyzing emotions? Garrett didn't have that time. He needed one thing only, proof that couldn't be denied. Because if he was wrong, if he falsely accused Warren, he would lose his most loyal second in command. And if he was right, he needed to know for certain before he acted. Because in this case, action would leave no road back. He set a trap. Simple. Clean. Not one unnecessary detail. That afternoon, Garrett called Warren into the study. Just the two of them. The door closed. Garrett told Warren that he would personally inspect a warehouse in the western suburbs on Saturday night at 10 o'clock. The warehouse held part of the family's reserve inventory, and Garrett had received word that there were signs of an inventory discrepancy. He would bring only 2 men with him. No need for many, he said. It was an inspection, not a fight. Warren listened, nodded, and asked whether Garrett needed him to come along. Garrett said no. He needed Warren to stay at the mansion and keep watch. Warren nodded again. Not one unusual expression. Not 1 second of hesitation. Perfect, as always. Garrett watched Warren walk out of the room and close the door behind him. He sat still. The information he had just given Warren was false. That warehouse was real. But Garrett wouldn't be going there. There was no inventory discrepancy. There was no trip. There was only one piece of information. One location. One time. And only one person knew it. If Warren was loyal, nothing would happen at that warehouse on Saturday night. If Warren wasn't loyal, Dunmore would come. Garrett called Stafford. He spoke briefly. Install cameras at the western warehouse. Place 3 men watching from a distance. Record everything. Don't interfere. Don't let anyone notice. Stafford asked who he was trapping. Garrett said, I hope no one. Saturday night, 10:15. Garrett sat in his study at the mansion, the phone on the desk, waiting. Warren was downstairs, working as usual, showing no sign that anything was wrong. The mansion was quiet. Catherine was asleep. Maeve was in her room. 10:43. Stafford called. Garrett picked up, listened. His face didn't change through the 2 minutes. Stafford spoke. Then he said, Send the pictures, and hung up. The phone vibrated. Images from the cameras. Garrett opened them. 3 cars. 7 men. Armed. They had arrived at the western warehouse, exactly at 10:10. 5 minutes before the time Garrett had said he would be there. They moved into ambush positions. They waited. They waited 40 minutes. No one came. Then they withdrew. The 3 cars left at 10:50. The license plate on one of the 3 cars matched the database Stafford had built over the past week. A Dunmore family car. Garrett looked at the photographs. Dunmore's team, at the exact location only Warren knew. In the exact time window only Warren knew. Carrying weapons to ambush a man only Warren knew would be there. There was no other way. No other explanation. No coincidence in the world could explain those photographs, except one single truth. Warren Briggs, 12 years. The man who had sworn unwavering loyalty when the empire was crumbling, whom Garrett trusted blindly as his own extension, was now selling his family to the highest bidder. Garrett placed the phone on the desk. His face was still. No anger. No sadness. Nothing showed on the surface. But his left hand, resting on the arm of the chair, began to tap with the ring finger, faster than usual, faster still. The rhythm broke, almost losing control. The finger striking the wood again and again, no longer holding the steady beat he always kept. 12 years. For 12 years, he had given this man his back. He had slept in the room beside this man. He had entrusted his mother's protection to this man. And this man had sold his mother's church schedule to the enemy. His finger tapped, 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 then stopped. Garrett sat still, breathed in, breathed out. When he opened his eyes, everything inside him had settled back into its proper place. There were no 12 years anymore, no brotherhood anymore, only a problem that needed to be solved. He calculated what came next. Warren would know the trap had snapped shut when Dunmore's team returned and told him the warehouse was empty. Warren was smart enough to understand immediately that Garrett knew. And then Warren would have to choose, run or strike. If he ran, Garrett would find him, sooner or later. If he struck, Warren knew the mansion's layout, knew the passwords, knew the weak points in the security system. He knew everything. That was the price of trusting someone completely. When that person betrayed you, he carried the map of your entire kingdom with him. Garrett called the mansion's head of security into the room. He spoke briefly. From now on, double the night guards, change the side gate passwords, add cameras to the western area. The security chief asked why. Garrett looked at him and said, "You don't need a reason. Do it before midnight." The security chief nodded and walked out. Garrett stood. He went up to the second floor, to his mother's room. The door was slightly open. Catherine was asleep, the blanket pulled up to her chest, her face peaceful. Maeve sat in the chair beside the bed, an open book on her lap, reading softly to Catherine even though Catherine had fallen asleep some time ago. Maybe Maeve knew she was asleep. Maybe she kept reading because she thought the sound of her voice would help Catherine sleep more deeply. Garrett looked at those two women. His mother and the housekeeper, the two people he couldn't afford to lose. Then he turned away, moved quickly back down to the first floor, and began preparing for the war he knew was coming. 2:00 in the morning. The Hollis mansion was sunk in silence. The garden lights were still on. The cameras were still recording. The guards were still standing in the positions that had been reinforced earlier that evening. Everything looked normal, but everything was changing beneath the surface, and the man changing it knew exactly where to touch. Warren Briggs made his move at 1:45. He stepped into the first-floor security control room, where the camera system was managed, using the excuse that he was checking the night watch schedule. The man on duty trusted him. Of course he trusted him. Warren was the second in command. He had the right to enter any room in this house. It took him less than 2 minutes to shut down all the cameras in the western area, the section that included the side gate, the low wall along the fence, and the stretch of backyard leading to the kitchen entrance. He didn't black them out. He switched them to replay old footage, enough that the man watching the screens wouldn't notice the difference unless he looked very closely at the timestamp in the lower corner. After that, he called the 3 guards in the western area to the main gate. Verbal order. Go check the northern access road. There had been a report of a strange car near the residential area. The 3 men went at once. No one questioned him. When Warren Briggs gave an order, no one questioned him. 1:50. The western side gate opened. Warren stood there, looking into the dark, and 3 cars with their lights off slowly entered the mansion grounds along the dirt road behind the property. Dunmore's team. 9 men. They knew the exact layout of the house, knew which room was where, knew which hallway led where, because the man who had drawn the map for them was the same man standing there, holding the gate. 2:00. They entered the house through the kitchen entrance. Garrett was in the first-floor study. He wasn't asleep. Not because of insomnia, but because he was waiting. Since that evening, when the security team reported that Warren had left the mansion at 9:00 and returned at 11:00 without explaining where he had gone, Garrett had known. Dunmore had received word that the warehouse was empty. Warren knew the trap had snapped shut, and Warren had chosen not to run. Garrett heard the first sound at 2:03. Not gunfire, footsteps. Many footsteps moving fast on the lower floor. Organized footsteps, the steps of men who knew where they were going. He opened the desk drawer and took out the handgun he always kept there. He checked it, stood, went into the hallway. At the same time, on the second floor, Maeve was asleep. She slept lightly, as always, the kind of sleep of someone used to being woken at any moment. The sound of footsteps running across the wooden floor below pulled her out of sleep in less than 1 second. She opened her eyes, lay still, listened. More footsteps. Then a short shout, the sound of something striking hard against a wall, and she knew at once this wasn't normal. She didn't think. She jumped out of bed, bare feet on the cold floor, and ran. Not down the stairs, not toward the noise. She ran to the right, along the second-floor hallway, toward Catherine's room. That was the first thing in her mind. Not herself, not Garrett. Catherine, the 64-year-old woman sleeping alone in the room at the end of the hallway, weak, in a wheelchair, unable to move quickly on her own. Maeve reached Catherine's room in less than 10 seconds, opened the door. Catherine was already awake, sitting propped against the bed, eyes wide, one hand gripping the edge of the blanket. She had heard it. She knew. Maeve entered the room, locked the door, and turned the latch. She looked around. The wooden cabinet beside the door. She shoved it, using all her strength, her shoulder still aching from the SUV attack, but she clenched her teeth and pushed until the cabinet blocked the door. Then she turned back to Catherine. Catherine was trying to slide down from the bed, her hands trembling, her legs unsteady. Maeve supported her, placed her in the wheelchair, and pushed her into the bathroom. The bathroom was small, with no windows, thick tiled walls, and only one door, the safest place in the room. Catherine held Maeve's hand. Her hand was shaking. Her eyes were frightened but not panicked. The eyes of someone who had lived long enough beside the Hollis family to know what kind of night this was. "I'm here," Maeve said. Her voice was steady. "No one's getting in." Then the gunfire rang out. Not one shot. Many shots, one after another, echoing up from the first floor, tearing through the wooden floorboards, shaking the very air. Shouts, running feet, breaking glass. The Hollis mansion, the house Garrett believed was a fortress, was being ripped open from the inside by the very man who knew it best. Maeve sat on the bathroom floor beside Catherine, her back against the wall, one hand holding Catherine's. She listened to every sound, trying to separate them, trying to understand what was happening beyond that door. The gunfire moved, rising from the lower floor, coming closer. Garrett's men were fighting back. She heard someone shouting orders, a voice that wasn't Warren's, wasn't Garrett's, a stranger's voice. Then answering gunfire, even closer now, right outside the second-floor hallway. Then she heard Garrett's voice. He wasn't shouting. He was speaking fast, short, giving orders to his men. His voice was in the hallway, close to Catherine's room. He was there. He was holding the hallway that led to his mother's room. She heard him respond, quick, precise. The kind of response from a man who had prepared for this moment before it happened. But she also heard that he was out there alone, or nearly alone, because his was the only voice she could hear on this side of the hallway. Maeve looked down at Catherine. Catherine looked back at her. The two women stared at each other inside the small bathroom. The bright white fluorescent light above them. Gunfire outside. Catherine said nothing, but her eyes moved toward the bathroom door, then back to Maeve. She understood. She understood what Maeve was thinking. She understood that her son was out there, and the girl sitting in front of her was forcing herself to stay instead of running to him. Silence for one beat. The gunfire still rang out. Then Catherine let go of Maeve's hand. She looked at her, her eyes wet, but her voice steady, steadier than Maeve had ever heard it. "Go." Maeve looked at her. 1 second. Then she stood, stepped out of the bathroom, pulled the cabinet back just enough to open the bedroom door, and ran into the hallway. 2 o'clock in the morning. The second-floor hallway was dark, lit only by the dim red emergency lights blinking on the ceiling. Thin smoke hung in the air, carrying the smell of gunpowder and burning wood. Maeve ran barefoot across the wooden floor, her heart pounding in her ears, her eyes struggling to adjust to the dark. She turned the corner leading toward the stairs, and she saw them. Garrett stood at the end of the hallway, about 15 meters from her. His back was against the wall, a gun in his right hand, aimed forward. His white shirt was covered in dust and scratches, and there was a long tear across his left forearm, but he didn't seem to realize it. 2 of his men lay on the hallway floor behind him, unconscious or wounded, not moving. He was standing alone, and at the other end of the hallway, about 5 meters from Garrett, Warren Briggs stepped out of the darkness. Warren looked different. Gone was the calm, polished composure Maeve had seen during all those weeks. His jacket was rumpled, sweat ran down his face, and his eyes had the bright, feverish look of a man who had burned the bridge behind him and knew there was no way back. In his hand was a gun, pointed at the floor, not raised yet. The 2 men looked at each other across the short stretch of hallway. Red light flickered over both their faces. 5 meters. 12 years. And there was nothing between them except air and smoke. Garrett spoke first. His voice wasn't loud, not angry, not shaking. He said 2 words. Only 2 words. And those 2 words weighed more than any sentence. 12 years. Warren didn't answer. Maybe he wanted to answer. Maybe he wanted to explain. Wanted to say that those 12 years hadn't been enough, that he deserved more than the position of second in command, that Dunmore had promised him things Garrett would never promise, but he didn't speak. Because he looked into Garrett's eyes, and he knew, as clearly as he knew his own name, that no explanation would change anything in those gray eyes. Everything was already over. The only thing left was how it would end. Warren raised the gun. Maeve saw the barrel move upward. She stood in the middle of the hallway, about 7 meters from Garrett, about 12 meters from Warren. She saw Warren's hand tighten around the grip. She saw the barrel turn toward Garrett, and in that moment, her mind went completely blank. No thought, no calculation, no question of why or what for. Only her legs moving. She ran. She ran toward Garrett, faster than she thought she could. Bare feet against wood. Unable to hear her own steps. unable to hear anything except the blood rushing through her head. She reached the space between the two men. She stepped out, right as Warren pulled the trigger. The shot. Loud. Close. Aching through her bones. The bullet hit Maeve's left shoulder. She felt it before she understood it. A hard force, as if someone had driven a fist straight into her shoulder. Then heat. A kind of heat she had never known. Spreading from her shoulder down her arm and up into her neck. Her legs lost their balance. She fell. Garrett screamed. It was the first scream anyone in his life had ever heard from him. People who had lived beside Garrett Hollis for 10 years had never heard him scream. He gave orders. He spoke softly. He stayed silent. But he didn't scream. And that scream, ringing through the hallway, tearing through smoke and darkness, wasn't the scream of the head of a family. It was the scream of a man who had just seen something he couldn't bear happening right in front of him, and he hadn't been fast enough to stop it. He rushed forward, dropped to his knees, caught Maeve. Her head lay in his hands, her eyes still open, her face white, her lips clenched tight. Her left shoulder was wet, warm, and Garrett felt that warmth soaking through his fingers, but he didn't look down at his hand. He looked at her face. Maeve looked at him. Her eyes weren't afraid. There was pain, terrible pain, but no fear. She tried to speak. Her voice was small, broken, each word costing her as much effort as lifting something heavy. "You, don't stop." Then her eyes closed. Her head grew heavier in his hands. She lost consciousness, not slowly, not drifting away little by little. She shut off, as if someone had pulled a plug, and her body went limp in Garrett's arms. He laid her on the floor, gently, supporting her head with one hand. Then he stood, turned toward Warren. Warren was still standing there. The gun was still in his hand. He looked at Maeve lying on the floor, then looked at Garrett, and for the first time that night, something appeared on Warren's face that hadn't been there before. Fear. Because Garrett's face now, the face of the man rising from beside the girl he had just watched fall, wasn't angry, wasn't wounded, didn't show anything at all. It was calm in a way that was terrifying. Calm like frozen water, with something deep and dark beneath it that no one wanted to look down into. Warren raised the gun again. But he wasn't fast enough. Noise from downstairs. Many footsteps. Fast. The front door flew open. Someone shouted, "Security! Get down!" Garrett's rescue team had arrived. Not the team inside the mansion. This was the backup team Garrett had activated before the trap snapped shut, positioned 10 minutes away from the mansion, with one order. If they didn't receive a check-in signal every 30 minutes after midnight, they were to enter immediately. Garrett hadn't sent the signal at 2 o'clock. They came in. 12 men flooded onto the second floor in less than 90 seconds. Warren was restrained, the gun ripped from his hand, 2 men pinning him to the floor. He didn't fight. Downstairs, Dunmore's team was neutralized and captured, one by one. The mansion was brought back under control. Garrett didn't look at Warren as they forced him down onto the floor, didn't look when they dragged him through the hallway. He turned back to Maeve. She lay on the wooden floor, eyes closed, face white, her left shoulder soaked through. He knelt. He slid one hand under her head, the other beneath her back, and lifted her into his arms. She was smaller than he had imagined, lighter than he had imagined. So light he had to hold her tighter because he was afraid she might slip out of his arms. And then he realized this was the first time he had truly held her, and she was too light, as if there was nothing inside this body except bone and will. "Open your eyes," he said. His voice was hoarse. He didn't recognize it. "Don't sleep. I'm taking you to the hospital." She didn't answer. He carried her down the hallway, stepping over shards of glass, past the Dunmore gunman being pinned to the floor, past Warren Briggs being held against the wall with his hands behind his back. He walked past Warren without turning his head, without looking, without saying another word. 12 years, and he passed him as if passing an overturned chair. The car was already running outside in the yard. Garrett climbed into the back seat, Maeve still in his arms, her head resting against his chest, her hand hanging loose. "Hospital," he said to the driver. One word. The car tore into the night, headlights cutting through the darkness, Chicago stretching ahead, and in the back seat, Garrett Hollis held the housekeeper in his arms, looked at her face, and for the first time in his life, didn't know what he was supposed to do next. She didn't open her eyes. The hospital at 4 o'clock in the morning looked different from how it did during the day. The hallways were empty. The fluorescent lights stayed a hard, unchanging white, and every sound was swallowed by the thick silence that only a hospital in the middle of the night could have. Garrett carried Maeve into the emergency room, without waiting for a stretcher, without waiting for a nurse to come out and receive her. He walked straight through the doors with her in his arms, and everyone moved out of his way, not because they knew who he was, but because no one wanted to stand in front of a man carrying a girl covered in blood while looking like that. They took Maeve into surgery. Garrett stood outside the door, his back against the wall, both hands hanging at his sides, and on his right hand, her blood was still there, slowly drying, changing from red to dark brown beneath the hallway lights. He didn't wash it off. He stood there for 1 hour and 40 minutes, until the surgeon stepped out. The doctor was a man in his 40s, his face tired, still wearing surgical scrubs. He spoke slowly, choosing each word, the way people speak when they're used to delivering bad news, while still having to leave some hope for the person listening. The bullet had been removed. It had lodged in her left shoulder, hadn't gone through bone, hadn't damaged any major blood vessel. Surgically, the operation had been successful, but the problem wasn't the bullet. The problem was her body. Maeve had lost too much blood before reaching the hospital. Her body wasn't responding to transfusion as quickly as normal. The doctor said she showed signs of prolonged exhaustion, that the old injuries on her back and ribs from a previous trauma hadn't fully healed. And there was one more thing the doctor said more slowly, more carefully, that her underlying health condition suggested her immune system was under abnormal strain, possibly connected to an undiagnosed or untreated issue they would need to examine further once she woke up. Garrett listened to every word. He didn't ask him to repeat himself. He asked only one question. "Will she wake up?" The doctor said, "We hope so, but her body needs time. Right now, all we can do is wait. Wait. Again, wait." Garrett Hollis, the man who controlled everything, sat down again in a plastic hospital chair and waited, just like 3 months earlier, when he had sat beside his mother's bed. But this time was different. The last time, he knew who his mother was, knew she was strong, knew she would wake because she was Catherine Hollis, and she didn't surrender to anything. This time, he sat beside a 27-year-old girl whose name he hadn't known 3 months earlier, the girl he had coldly questioned in the hospital, had brought back to the mansion as part of an exchange, had heard say she was afraid of disappearing, and now she was lying in a hospital bed because she had stepped between him and a bullet without anyone asking her to. He sat beside her bed, held her hand. Maeve lay still, her face white, her eyes closed, the monitor beeping steadily, fluid running through the line in her arm, a light oxygen tube beneath her nose. She looked small on the hospital bed, the same way his mother had looked small on a hospital bed 3 months earlier, and Garrett realized that hospital beds had a way of making everyone look smaller than themselves. 10 o'clock in the morning. The door opened. Catherine Hollis sat in a wheelchair, one of Garrett's men pushing her in. She had heard the news from Garrett's people, who had called the mansion at 5 o'clock in the morning. She hadn't waited for anyone to come get her. She had forced the men left at the mansion to take her to the hospital as soon as the sun came up. She entered the room, looked at Maeve on the bed, looked at her son sitting beside the girl's bed, both hands wrapped around her hand, his eyes red, dried blood still on the cuff of his shirt. She looked at that scene and stayed silent for a long time. She had seen her son cold before his enemies, calm in the face of danger, weeping beside her bed while she was in a coma. But she had never seen him sit like this for someone else, for someone who wasn't her. She motioned for the man to push the wheelchair to the other side of the bed. She took Maeve's other hand, that small, cold hand, lying still on the bedsheet. She held it between both of her own, warming it, the way she had once warmed Garrett's hands when he was a child. Then she looked at Garrett. She didn't ask what had happened, didn't ask where Warren was. She didn't need to ask, because she had lived beside the Hollis family long enough to understand everything just from the way her son was sitting. She said, "Listen to me." Her voice was soft, weaker than before, but steady. "Make sure that when she opens her eyes, everything is over. Don't let her wake up in a world that's still dangerous. Do you hear me?" Garrett looked at his mother. She looked back at him. Her eyes were like his, the same gray, the same direct stare that didn't look away. She was right. He knew she was right. He had been sitting here long enough to understand that sitting here wouldn't save Maeve. The doctors would do their part. Her body would fight its part. But his part, The part only he could do, still wasn't finished. Warren was being held in a place controlled by Garrett's men. But Dunmore was still out there. Philip Dunmore was still free, still had men, still had money. And now he knew that Garrett knew. A beast trapped against a wall was more dangerous than a beast still stalking from a distance. Garrett wasn't finished. He nodded to his mother, slowly. Then he turned back to Maeve. He bent down, close to her face, and said softly, just loud enough for her to hear if somewhere in the darkness behind those closed eyelids she could still hear him. "I'll come back." Then he placed her hand down on the bed, gently, stood, and walked out of the room. Catherine stayed. She held Maeve's hand, warming it, and began to tell stories. She spoke softly, her voice even, like she was telling a child a bedtime story. She talked about the garden at the mansion, about the maple trees beginning to change color, about the flower pot she wanted to plant when the weather grew warmer. She talked about the chicken soup she would make when Maeve woke up, her mother's recipe, with more onions than usual, because she believed onions could cure anything. She held the hand of the girl she had called child, and spoke to her even though Maeve couldn't hear, because Catherine Hollis believed people in a coma could still hear, and she wouldn't let Maeve lie in the dark alone without any voice there to hold her back. Every day after that, she came. Every day, she held her hand. Every day, she told stories. Her hand was always warm. Garrett stepped out of Maeve's hospital room and called Stafford from the hallway. The call lasted 4 minutes. When he hung up, the plan was complete. It wasn't a new plan. Garrett had been thinking about it since the night the trap snapped shut at the warehouse. From the moment he looked at the photographs of Dunmore's team appearing in the exact place only Warren knew about, he had known what he was going to do to Dunmore. He had only been waiting for the right moment. And now, standing in the hospital hallway, at 11 o'clock in the morning, with the housekeeper's blood still on his shirt cuff, he decided that moment had come. The move Garrett chose wasn't guns. It wasn't fire. It wasn't the loud kind of revenge men in the underworld like to use as a display of power. He chose something more ruthless than all of those things combined. He chose the law. In the Mafia world, there was an unwritten rule every family understood. You could be defeated by a rival, have territory taken from you, lose men, and still get back on your feet. But if you were handed to the police by your own rival, you were finished. Not because of the prison sentence. Because of what it meant. In a world built on reputation and fear, being pushed into the hands of the federal authorities by an enemy meant you were so weak they didn't even need to dirty their hands. Only make one phone call. No one would do business with you again. No one would fear you again. No one would speak your name again, except as an example of a loser. That wasn't death. That was being erased from the board. Garrett called the family's intermediary attorney, a man named Howard Peck, 62 years old, who had worked for the Hollis family since Richard's time and specialized in handling problems no other lawyer wanted to touch. Garrett spoke to Peck briefly. Compile all financial documents, recordings, surveillance images from the warehouse, evidence connecting Warren Briggs to the Dunmore family, receipts of money transferred through shell accounts, and the transaction history Stafford had spent 3 weeks untangling. Everything. Package it, and send it to the FBI through a channel Peck had built over many years. A channel that left no trace leading back to Garrett Hollis or the Hollis family. On paper, this would be an anonymous tip. Someone inside the financial system had discovered irregularities and decided to report them to the federal authorities. No name, no face, no clear motive. Peck asked, "Are you sure? Once this door opens, it can't be closed again." Garrett said, "Open it." The FBI received the file on the second day. Garrett knew the federal process. They wouldn't act immediately. They would verify, cross-check, request warrants. Everything had to follow procedure, because if one step was wrong, Dunmore's lawyers would overturn the table in court. Garrett wasn't in a hurry. He was patient. Patience was the cheapest thing he had, and the most expensive thing his enemies had to pay for. 10 days. Garrett divided his time between 2 places. During the day, he stayed in a temporary office at a secure location, making calls, arranging matters, keeping the Hollis family operating normally as if nothing had happened. At night, he stayed at the hospital, sitting beside Maeve's bed, holding her hand, watching the monitor blink. She didn't change. Every day the doctor came in to check on her and spoke in careful sentences. Her numbers were stable. They weren't getting worse, but they weren't getting better yet either. She needed more time. Garrett listened, nodded, then turned back to Maeve. Catherine came every day. She sat on the other side of the bed, held Maeve's hand, and told stories. She and Garrett rarely spoke to each other in the hospital room. They only sat there, one on each side, holding the two hands of the girl neither of them could afford to lose. Sometimes Catherine looked across at Garrett, saw his eyes on Maeve, and knew her son had changed in a way she hadn't thought he could change. On the 7th day, in the evening, Garrett sat beside Maeve's bed, one hand holding hers, the other resting on his thigh. The room was quiet. Catherine had gone back to the mansion to rest. There was only the sound of the monitor. The phone in his pocket vibrated. He took it out. A message from Peck. 2 words. Tomorrow. Garrett looked at the screen, then looked at Maeve, then turned off the phone, slipped it back into his pocket, and held her hand again with both of his. On the 8th day, at 6 o'clock in the morning, the FBI raided the Dunmore family's operating headquarters in the Eastern Industrial District of Chicago. At the same time, 3 other locations connected to the Dunmore network were searched. Assets were frozen. Accounts were locked. 14 people were arrested that morning. Philip Dunmore was arrested at his private residence at 6:15, still in his sleepwear, in front of the cameras of 2 television stations that someone had informed in advance about the time and location of the raid. Garrett didn't watch the news. He didn't need to. At 7 o'clock in the morning, he sat in Maeve's hospital room, his phone vibrating constantly. Messages from Stafford, from Peck, from contacts inside the family. He didn't open them. He sat still, holding Maeve's hand, looking at her face, and waiting for the only message he truly wanted to receive, the one saying she had opened her eyes. Finally, he took out his phone and glanced at it. One headline on the screen: Philip Dunmore and 14 members of his organization arrested in FBI sweep in Chicago. He looked at that line for 2 seconds. Then he turned off the screen, set the phone on the table, and went back to holding her hand. He didn't call Dunmore, didn't send a message, didn't send any word at all, didn't confirm anything. Throughout the entire process, from the day Peck sent the file to the day the FBI knocked on the door, Garrett Hollis had not had a single interaction with Philip Dunmore. Not directly, not indirectly. Dunmore would know. Of course he would know who was behind it. But knowing and proving were 2 different things. And in the world of law, only what could be proved had value. Garrett left no trace. He only left a result. Warren Briggs. Garrett didn't speak that name to anyone, except those who needed to know. Warren had to face the consequences under the family's law. The unwritten law, the law everyone who entered this world understood from the first day. Not publicly, not loudly. No one outside the family knew what happened to Warren Briggs after that night. 12 years of brotherhood ended in silence, and silence was the last thing Warren received from Garrett. Garrett didn't feel satisfied. He had thought he would feel something when Dunmore fell. Relief, perhaps, or justice, though he wasn't the kind of man who used that word. But he felt nothing. Only tired. The kind of tired that didn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying too many things for too long, without being allowed to put them down. His mother had almost died. The man he trusted most had betrayed him. The only girl who had ever stepped between him and death was lying in a coma because of a bullet meant for him, and he had solved all of it, piece by piece, with the patience and ruthlessness his father had taught him. But none of it brought her back. He returned to the hospital that evening, sat in the familiar plastic chair beside Maeve's bed, held her hand. The monitor beeped steadily. Everything was done. Dunmore had fallen. Warren was gone. The mansion was safe. His mother was well. The world outside this hospital room had been cleared, exactly as Catherine had said, exactly as he had promised. But she still hadn't opened her eyes. That night, the hospital was emptier than usual. The 4th-floor hallway had no footsteps, no rolling carts, no nurses calling to one another. There was only the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the sound of the monitor in Maeve's room, steady, patient, keeping rhythm for a woman lying between 2 shores when no one knew which shore she would choose. Garrett sat in the plastic chair beside the bed. He had sat in that chair for 10 nights now. He knew exactly where it was hard, where it leaned, and that if he shifted just far enough to the left, his shoulder could rest against the side of the bed. He knew this chair better than any chair in the mansion, and that was something he never would have imagined knowing 3 months ago. He held Maeve's hand. Her hand was warmer than it had been in the first days. The doctor said that was a good sign. Garrett didn't know how good it was, but he recognized the difference, because he had held this hand long enough to know how its temperature changed from one day to the next. He began to speak, not loudly, not in the way someone spoke to be heard, in the way of a man who had kept too many things in his head for too long and needed to set them down somewhere. And the only place he felt he could set them down was this room, in front of her. "It's done," he said. His voice was soft, even, almost a whisper. Dunmore was arrested this morning. The FBI raided him. Assets frozen. His men taken in. He was on television at 6 o'clock in the morning, still wearing his pajamas. He paused for a beat. "You would have liked that part. I think you would have liked it." He kept going. Warren was gone. 12 years. And now that name no longer existed inside the Hollis family. He didn't give details. There was no need. He only said, he faced the consequences, the way the rules said from the beginning. Then he went quiet for a while, as if even he needed time to hear those words echo in the empty room. The mansion's being repaired, the damaged parts in the second-floor hallway and the side gate. My mother says we have to repaint the living room too because she's tired of the old color. He said it, and one corner of his mouth moved slightly, almost a smile, but not enough to be called one. She's better now. She walked a few steps on her own, without the wheelchair, even though the doctor said she shouldn't yet. You know how she is. No one can tell her anything. His voice slowed, softened, like a man walking a long road whose legs were growing heavy, but who kept moving because he hadn't reached the end yet. "My mother comes here every day to sit with you," he said. "Every day. She holds your hand and tells you stories. All kinds of things. Cooking, the weather, flowers in the garden. She talks to you more than she talks to me." He stopped, swallowed. "She calls you child. Did you know that? She hasn't called anyone that except me. Never." Silence. The monitor beeped steadily. Garrett looked at Maeve's face. Her eyes were closed. Her face held the kind of peace that belonged to someone who didn't know where she was, and he wished that peace were real peace, not the peace of a body gathering strength to decide whether to live or let go. "Open your eyes, Maeve," he said it softly. Not as an order, not as a plea, somewhere between the two, in a place Garrett Hollis had never been in his life. A place where he couldn't control the outcome, and knew he couldn't control it, but spoke anyway, because if he didn't speak, he didn't know what else he could do. She didn't answer. The monitor beeped. Steady, steady, steady. He bowed his head. His forehead nearly touched the back of her hand on the bedsheet. His eyes were heavy. Not sleepy heavy, but heavy in the way a body became when it had decided it had endured enough, carried enough, stayed awake enough, and would stop whether he wanted it to or not. His shoulders sagged. His back curved forward. His head grew heavy. His left hand still rested on the metal bed rail. His ring finger tapped softly, steady, slower than usual. The rhythm he had carried all his life. The rhythm no one dared mention. The rhythm of vigilance, of worry, of a man who always had to keep himself awake, to keep everything from falling apart. That rhythm slowed. Slowed again. The space between each tap grew longer, longer still, like a heartbeat sinking into sleep. Then it stopped. His finger lay still on the bed rail, no longer tapping. Garrett Hollis drifted off, his head lowered beside Maeve's hand on the bed, his forehead touching the bedsheet, his hair brushing her fingers. His right hand still held hers, even in sleep, his fingers still holding on, the body's final instinct before consciousness shut down completely. He slept. Truly slept. For the first time in many days. Not a 10-minute doze before jerking awake. Not the kind of sleep with his legs propped on the desk in his study. He slept like a man who had been emptied completely, and whose body refused to let him stay awake for one more second. The hospital room was still. Hallway light slipped through the crack in the door, a thin strip of brightness on the floor. The monitor beeped steadily. Garrett slept, his hand still holding hers. And on the bedsheet, inside the hand Garrett was holding, Maeve's finger moved. The light came first. Not clear light. A blurred white glow, slipping through her eyelids from somewhere very far away, like looking at the sun through deep water. Maeve felt it before she understood what it was. She had been in the dark for a very long time, the kind of darkness with no dreams, no sound, nothing except complete absence. And now something was pulling her back, slowly, little by little, like a patient hand drawing a thread from a spool. She hadn't opened her eyes yet, but she could feel There was a hand holding her right hand, warm, larger than hers. The fingers held just firmly enough, not too tight, not too loose, the kind of hold belonging to someone who had held on for so long that his hand remembered the pressure without needing his mind to command it. And on the back of her hand, something rested lightly, a finger, lying still, not moving, as if it had just stopped in the middle of doing something she didn't know about. She felt more. Her left hand was being held too. Another hand, smaller, drier, warm in a different way. Warm in the way old people were warm, the kind of warmth she had never felt in her life, or had felt a very long time ago. So long ago she no longer remembered. She opened her eyes, slowly. Her eyelids were heavy as lead. White light flooded in, too bright, and she closed them again, then opened them once more. Everything was blurred. A white ceiling, fluorescent lights, the edge of a window. Then things became clearer. Gradually, like a photograph coming into focus. She turned her head to the right. Slowly, her neck was stiff. Her whole body ached. Not with sharp pain, but with a dull, lingering ache, as if her body had been hurting for so long it had grown used to it, and could only vaguely remember what normal felt like. Garrett was slumped beside the bed, asleep. His forehead was almost touching the back of her hand on the bedsheet, his hair brushing her fingers. His right hand still held hers, even in sleep. His face, while sleeping, was different from every version of him she had ever seen. There was nothing hard on it, no layer of control, no cold gray eyes measuring everything, only a tired face, younger than 33, with deep shadows beneath his eyes and a crease between his brows that he never allowed anyone to see while awake. He looked like someone who had carried too much for too long and had just been set down for a moment. She looked at his hand. His right hand was holding hers. His left hand rested on the metal bed rail, and his ring finger lay lightly against the back of her hand, still, unmoving, as if it had just finished tapping its final beat and forgotten to stop, or hadn't forgotten, but simply didn't need to tap anymore. She looked at that finger. She didn't know why she understood, but she did. That finger had been tapping for a very long time, and it had just stopped. She tried to move her right hand. Pain. Her left shoulder flared even though she hadn't moved that shoulder, as if her body remembered the wound and reacted before her mind could reach it. She clenched her teeth, softly, and moved her right hand inside his. Just a little. Her fingers curved, touching his palm. Then she lifted her left hand, slowly, bit by bit, every inch an effort, and placed it over his left hand on the bed rail. She set her hand over his finger, held it still. His fingers lay motionless beneath her hand, and she kept them there, gently, as if holding something she didn't want to let move anymore. Garrett startled awake. His eyes opened, fast, sharp, the way the eyes of someone used to being awakened by danger opened. He looked down at his hands first, his right hand inside hers, with her fingers curled around his. His left hand, on the bed rail, with her hand resting over it, keeping it still. He looked at those two hands for 1 second, then he looked up. Her eyes were open, looking at him. He looked at her. She looked at him. No one spoke. The room was still. The monitor beeped steadily, and that rhythm was a note higher than before, steadier, stronger, the heartbeat of someone who was here, awake, alive. Maeve opened her mouth. She had to try twice before sound came out. Her voice was hoarse, small, almost impossible to hear. The voice of someone who hadn't spoken for many days, and whose throat had forgotten how to vibrate. "You finally slept." 4 words. The first sentence she said after waking from all those days in a coma, after the bullet, after the blood, after the darkness, wasn't about herself. She didn't ask where she was, what had happened, whether she was all right. It was about him. She looked at him, and the first thing she told him was that he had slept, because she had seen his face while he slept, had seen the shadows beneath his eyes, had seen the exhaustion he hid when he was awake, and the first thing in her mind wasn't her own pain but the fact that he hadn't slept enough. Garrett held her hand tighter. His eyes were red, but no tears fell. He had cried for the last time in his mother's room 3 months earlier, and perhaps his body had decided once was enough for a lifetime. But his eyes were red, and his jaw was clenched, and his hand tightened around hers in a way that let her feel he was holding himself back from something enormous inside. He said nothing. He only held her hand, and she let him. The monitor beeped steadily. Her heartbeat was stable, even, strong, stronger with every minute, alive. And on the other side of the bed, the small, dry, warm hand was still holding her left hand. Maeve turned her head. Catherine sat in the chair on the other side of the bed, her head tipped back against the chair, eyes closed, asleep. She had been here all night. She had held Maeve's hand all night, and now, in sleep, her hand held a little more softly, as if even asleep, she was still holding on, still not letting go. Maeve looked at Catherine's hand holding hers, that warm hand, the hand of a woman whose name she hadn't known 3 months earlier, the hand of a woman who had called her child. And in that quiet hospital room, near dawn, Maeve felt against her left hand something she had lost when she was 12 years old and never thought she would feel again. She didn't name it. She only lay still, holding the 2 hands that were holding her, and breathed. The next morning, the hospital room door opened. Maeve turned her head from the window and looked back. Catherine Hollis walked in. No wheelchair. For the first time, she held a cane in her right hand, moving slowly, with short steps, but she was walking on her own. Each step was firm in the way of a woman who had decided that today she would walk on her own 2 feet, no matter what anyone said. She wore a gray sweater, her silver hair neatly brushed, her face still carrying traces of the weeks and months just past, but her eyes were bright, the kind of brightness Maeve had seen when she laughed in the garden beneath the maple trees. She walked to the side of the bed, leaned the cane against the chair, sat down, took Maeve's hand. "My daughter." 2 words, only 2 words. Her voice was soft, warm, steady, as if she had been saying those 2 words to Maeve in her mind for many days, and was only now speaking them aloud for the first time when Maeve could hear them. Maeve looked at her, looked at Catherine's hand holding hers, looked into the gray eyes that looked like Garrett's but gentler, warmer, the eyes of a woman who had lost a husband, had almost lost her own life, had watched her son live in a world she hadn't chosen but had accepted, and still managed to keep something soft inside herself after all of it. And Maeve, the 27-year-old girl who hadn't cried when she received the threatening envelope, hadn't cried when the SUV dragged her across the pavement, hadn't cried when the bullet tore through her shoulder, looked at Catherine Hollis and her eyes grew wet. Not loud crying, just wet. Tears rose silently and spilled over her eyelids, sliding down her temples and soaking into the pillow. She didn't wipe them away. She let them stay, because these weren't tears of pain or fear. They were the tears of someone who had just been called by a word she had lost when she was 12 years old and never thought she would hear again. Garrett stood in the doorway. She didn't know when he had arrived. He stood there, his back against the doorframe, looking in. His mother sat beside the bed, holding Maeve's hand. Maeve held his mother's hand. The 2 women looked at each other without needing to say anything more, and Garrett watched that scene, and for the first time he realized something he hadn't noticed until it was right there in front of him. His hands hung loose at his sides. The ring finger of his left hand lay still. No tapping, no rhythm, nothing to watch for, nothing to control. For the first time in a very long time, perhaps for the first time in his life, that finger was completely silent. That afternoon, Maeve slept. Her body needed a lot of sleep, the doctor said. That was how it repaired itself. Garrett sat in the room, watching her sleep, then looked at her bag placed at the foot of the bed. The bag was small, old, its strap frayed, and it held everything she owned in the world. He picked it up, meaning to arrange things neatly so she could reach them more easily when she needed them. Inside were a few hastily folded sets of clothes, identification papers, a toothbrush, and a small folded piece of paper tucked between 2 shirts. He opened it. An appointment notice. Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Pulmonology Department. Lung tumor biopsy results. The appointment date printed on the paper had passed nearly a week ago. She hadn't gone. The paper had been folded carefully, as if she had folded and unfolded it many times, often enough for the crease to wear thin, but not with enough courage, or not enough concern for herself, to actually walk into the clinic and hear the answer. Or maybe she had no one to go with her. Or both. Garrett looked at the paper. He remembered the surgeon talking about her abnormal underlying health condition, about her immune system being under strain, about something still undiagnosed. Now he understood. He stayed silent for a long time, looking at the paper in his hand, looking at Maeve asleep on the bed. She had lived with this alone, told no one, not because she was strong, but because she had no one to tell. She had faced the possibility that she might die by turning off her phone, turning toward the wall, and going to sleep, because that was how she had faced everything in her life. Alone, in silence. He folded the paper again and put it into the pocket of his suit jacket. Took out his phone. Called. The call lasted 3 minutes. When he hung up, he had the name of the best lung cancer specialist in Chicago, an appointment for the following week, and every expense would be handled by him without anyone needing to ask. When Maeve woke, she looked toward the table beside the bed. There was a new piece of paper, an appointment notice, printed clearly, with the doctor's name, the clinic address, and the exact date and time. The old paper was gone. She looked at the new paper, then looked at Garrett sitting in the chair beside her bed, his eyes on her, calm, offering no explanation, asking no question. "Why?" she asked. Her voice was still hoarse, but steadier than yesterday. Garrett looked at her. "You didn't leave my mother alone," he said. "I won't leave you alone." Maeve looked at him, looked at the paper, looked at him again. She didn't say anything more, didn't thank him, didn't refuse, didn't explain why she had hidden it, why she hadn't gone to the appointment, why she had lived with that fear alone. She only picked up the paper, held it in her hand, looked at it, and this time she didn't shut down, didn't fold it and shove it into the bottom of a bag, didn't turn her face toward the wall. She held it in front of her and read every line, from the doctor's name to the address to the appointment date, reading like someone allowing herself for the first time to believe the outcome might be different if someone went with her. Maeve Langley wasn't fully healed. There was still so much ahead of her. The wound in her shoulder needed time to mend. The biopsy results needed to be faced. A life had to be rebuilt from the beginning, and she didn't yet know what it would look like. But she was no longer alone. For the first time in 27 years, someone knew she was here. Someone had seen her when the whole world looked straight through her. Someone wouldn't let her disappear. And Garrett Hollis, the man half of Chicago didn't dare speak of by name. The man who had inherited an empire and held it with a silence colder than any threat. The man who had never kept anything beside him without using power or fear, had for the first time in his life someone who stayed with him, not because she feared him, not because she owed him, not because she needed him, but because she had chosen him, because she had stepped between him and death without anyone asking. Sometimes power can protect people from enemies, but it can't protect them from loneliness. Sometimes the person who changes our life isn't the strongest, or the richest, or the most powerful. It is the bravest one, the one who steps between us and danger for no reason except the instinct to love. A person's worth doesn't lie in social position, doesn't lie in the money in a bank account, doesn't lie in the name printed on a business card. A hotel housekeeper, an invisible woman, someone whose face no one remembered, can bring something an entire empire could never buy with money. A sincere presence, the choice to stay, the refusal to walk away. If this story touched you, please press like to support us. Share this video with someone you think needs to hear it tonight. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. We'd truly love to know how this story made you feel, so please leave a comment sharing what you felt deep in your heart. We read every line and treasure every word. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace every single day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.